The saloon in Tucson buzzed with the rough laughter of cowboys, miners, and drifters who had gathered to escape the brutal Arizona heat of summer 1882. Jake Sullivan sat at his usual table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him and a cocky grin plastered across his sun-weathered face. At 28, Jake had earned a reputation as the smoothest talker and most successful gambler in 3 territories, a man who could charm his way out of any trouble and into any woman's heart. Or so he believed. "I'm telling you, boys," Jake drawled, his Irish accent thick with alcohol and bravado. "There ain't a woman alive who can resist the Sullivan charm. Rich or poor, young or old, pretty or plain, doesn't matter a lick. Give me one evening, and I'll have any gal eating out of my hand." His drinking companions, a motley crew of ranch hands and fortune seekers, exchanged knowing glances. They had heard Jake's boasts countless times before, and while he had indeed enjoyed considerable success with the ladies of Tucson, his arrogance had grown tiresome. "Is that so?" drawled Marcus Webb, a grizzled cattle driver with a reputation for cruel humor. "Well then, Sullivan, I got a challenge for you. One that'll put your money where your mouth is." Jake leaned back in his chair, his green eyes glittering with confidence. "Name your terms, Webb. I ain't never backed down from a challenge yet." Webb's grin turned predatory. "There's an Apache settlement about 20 miles north of here. Trading post run by a fellow named Bill Thompson, who married into the tribe. Now, Bill's got a sister-in-law named Aisha. Nice enough woman, I hear, but she's, well, let's just say she's built more for comfort than for speed, if you catch my meaning." The other men snickered, and Jake felt his stomach turn slightly at the cruel implications. But his pride was stronger than his conscience, and he maintained his confident facade. "What exactly are you proposing, Webb?" "Simple wager," Webb continued. "You ride up to that settlement, court this Apache woman, and convince her to marry you within 1 week. Not just flirt with her, mind you, actual marriage, in front of her people and everything. You pull that off, and every man at this table will pay you $50. Jake did quick mental arithmetic. 8 men, $50 each. That was $400, more than many folks saw in a year. The money was tempting, but it was the challenge to his reputation that really hooked him. "And if I fail?" he asked, though he had no intention of failing. "You pay us each 50, plus you have to publicly admit that the great Jake Sullivan ain't quite as irresistible as he claims." The saloon had grown quiet around them, other patrons drawn by the increasingly loud conversation. Jake felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. His reputation was his most valuable asset. Without it, he was just another drifter with a silver tongue and fast hands. "You're on," Jake said, standing and extending his hand to shake on the bet. 1 week to marry this Aisha woman. "Easy money, boys." As the men cheered and called for another round to celebrate their wager, Jake felt a small nagging voice in the back of his mind, warning him that he might be making a terrible mistake. But he pushed the doubt aside with practiced ease. He had never met a woman he couldn't charm, and he wasn't about to start now, what Jake didn't. Understand, what his arrogance prevented him from seeing was that he was about to encounter someone who would challenge every assumption he had ever made about strength, beauty, and the true nature of love. The bet that seemed like easy money was about to become the most transformative experience of his life. 2 days later, Jake Sullivan rode north through the Arizona desert, his saddlebags packed with gifts, and his head full of strategies for winning over his unsuspecting bride-to-be. He had no idea that the woman waiting for him in the Apache settlement possessed a kind of power that no amount of charm or manipulation could overcome. The quiet, unshakable strength of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. But Jake's destination was fixed in his mind. He would win this bet, collect his money, and add another conquest to his long list of romantic victories. After all, how difficult could it be to charm one lonely Apache woman? He was about to find out that the answer to that question would change everything he thought he knew about himself and the nature of true connection between two souls. The Apache settlement materialized from the desert heat like a mirage made real. Its collection of traditional wickiups and newer adobe buildings clustered around a natural spring that created an oasis of green in the vast brown landscape. Jake Sullivan rode into the trading post compound with his usual swagger, but he found himself momentarily sobered by the dignity and purposefulness of the people going about their daily business. Bill Thompson, the white trader who had married into the tribe, emerged from the main store building, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and the respectful bearing of someone who had learned to navigate between two worlds successfully. "Afternoon. Stranger," Thompson called out. "What brings you to our little settlement?" Jake dismounted and extended his hand with his most charming smile. "Jake Sullivan, at your service. I'm a cattle buyer, looking to establish some trade relationships in this part of the territory. Heard you folks might be interested in doing some business." It was a plausible enough story, and Thompson seemed to accept it at face value. "Always happy to talk business. Come on inside, get yourself out of this heat. My wife's sister just made fresh bread, and there's coffee on the stove." As they walked toward the main building, Jake scanned the settlement, looking for his target. He spotted several Apache women going about their daily tasks, but none who matched Webb's description of Aisha. Perhaps she was inside, he thought, or maybe working elsewhere in the compound. The interior of the trading post was surprisingly comfortable, with shelves lined with goods from both white and Apache cultures. Blankets woven in traditional patterns hung beside bolts of store-bought fabric, while handcrafted pottery shared space with manufactured tools and household items. "Maria," Thompson called to a middle-aged Apache woman who emerged from the back room. "We have a visitor. Jake Sullivan. Meet my wife, Maria Thompson." Maria greeted Jake with polite reserve, her dark eyes studying him with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating strangers. Before Jake could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway of the back room, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Aisha was not what he had expected. Yes, she was fuller-figured than the women Jake usually pursued, but there was something about her presence that immediately commanded attention. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with long black hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the light. Her face was strikingly beautiful, high cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, and features that spoke of strength and character. Her traditional Apache dress was beautifully made, decorated with intricate beadwork that demonstrated both skill and artistic vision. But it was not her appearance that stopped Jake cold. It was the way she carried herself. Aisha moved with quiet confidence, unhurried and purposeful. When her eyes met his across the room, Jake saw no shyness or deference, only calm assessment. This was a woman who knew her own worth and did not need validation from anyone, least of all a cocky cowboy with questionable motives. "Aisha," Maria said in English, then switched to Apache for a few words Jake could not understand. "This is Jake Sullivan. He is interested in trading with us." Aisha stepped forward and nodded politely. "Welcome to our home," she said in clear, accented English. "You have traveled far in the heat. Please, sit and rest." Her voice was warm but not flirtatious, welcoming but not eager. Jake found himself momentarily at a loss for words, an extremely rare occurrence for someone whose livelihood depended on his silver tongue. "Thank you," he managed, accepting the offered chair at the wooden table. "I appreciate your hospitality. This is a beautiful place you have here." Aisha brought him coffee and a plate of the fresh bread Thompson had mentioned, along with honey and butter. As she set the food before him, Jake caught a whiff of her scent, something clean and herbal with hints of sage and sweetgrass. Her movements were graceful despite her size, and Jake found himself watching the way her capable hands arranged the items on the table with unconscious artistry. "You are cattle buyer?" Aisha asked, settling into a chair across from him. "What kind of business you seek with Apache people?" Jake launched into his prepared story about establishing trade relationships, but he found it difficult to concentrate on his fabrication while under Aisha's steady gaze. She listened attentively, asking occasional questions that demonstrated both intelligence and a shrewd understanding of business matters. As the afternoon progressed, and Jake was invited to share the evening meal with the family, he began to realize that his original plan, sweep in with charm and manipulation, dazzle a lonely woman into hasty marriage, was going to be far more complicated than he had imagined. Aisha was not lonely or desperate. She was surrounded by family and community, clearly valued for her skills and wisdom. During dinner, Jake watched her interact with others and saw the respect with which she was treated. Children sought her attention, adults asked her opinion on various matters, and her contributions to conversations were listened to with genuine interest. More troubling for Jake's peace of mind was his own reaction to her. He had expected to feel superior, perhaps even contemptuous, toward the woman he was planning to use for his bet. Instead, he found himself genuinely curious about her thoughts and opinions. When she smiled, which she did often, though not specifically at him, it transformed her entire face with warmth and intelligence that made Jake's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. As evening fell and Thompson offered him a place to sleep in the guest quarters, Jake realized that his week-long conquest was not going to unfold as easily as he had anticipated. Aisha was not a woman who could be charmed or manipulated. If he was going to win this bet, he would have to find an entirely different approach. What Jake did not yet understand was that Aisha had seen through his cattle buyer story within the first hour of his arrival, and that she was conducting her own careful evaluation of his character. The question was not whether he could win her over. It was whether he was worthy of the extraordinary woman he had so casually wagered to deceive. 3 days into his stay at the Apache settlement, Jake Sullivan found his carefully constructed plans crumbling like adobe in a desert storm. Every strategy he had used successfully with other women failed completely with Aisha, not because she rejected his advances, but because she seemed to see right through them to something deeper that even Jake himself had forgotten existed. On the morning of his third day, Jake woke to find Aisha already up and working in the garden behind the trading post. Her hands covered in rich earth as she tended to plants that thrived despite the harsh desert climate. When she noticed him watching from the doorway, she offered him a genuine smile and gestured for him to join her. "Your hands look soft," she observed without criticism, examining his palms when he knelt beside her. You have not done much work with Earth, I think. Jake felt unexpectedly ashamed of his manicured appearance, which had always been a source of pride as evidence of his success as a gambler rather than a laborer. I suppose not, he admitted. My work has been more cerebral. Aisha's eyes sparkled with amusement. Cerebral, big word. You mean you think more than you do? The gentle teasing in her voice caught Jake off guard. Most women either flattered him or competed for his attention. But Aisha treated him like a friend might, with affection mixed with honest assessment of his weaknesses. I suppose that's one way to put it, Jake said, finding himself smiling genuinely for the first time in days. What are you growing here? For the next 2 hours, Aisha taught him about desert gardening, how to conserve water, which plants provided medicine as well as food, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated when vegetables were ready for harvest. Her knowledge was vast and practical, gained through years of careful observation and experimentation. Apache people, we watch everything, she explained, showing him how to feel the soil to determine its moisture content. Sky, earth, plants, animals, all connected, all teaching us if we listen. As she spoke, Jake found himself genuinely interested in what she was saying rather than simply waiting for an opportunity to deploy his charm. Her intelligence was different from the book learning he had acquired in various schools. It was wisdom earned through experience and passed down through generations of her people. What about people? Jake asked impulsively. Do you watch people the same way? Aisha paused in her work and looked at him directly, her dark eyes serious but not unkind. Yes, she said simply. People also tell stories about themselves, even when they think they hide truth. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. And what story do you think I'm telling? For a long moment, Aisha studied his face with the same careful attention she gave to her plants. I think you are a man who has forgotten who he really is, she said finally. You wear masks so long, maybe you think mask is your face. But underneath... She reached out and briefly touched his hand. Underneath, I see someone who is tired of pretending. The accuracy of her observation hit Jake like a physical blow. He jerked his hand away and stood up quickly, his defenses slamming back into place. I think you're reading too much into things, he said, his voice cooler than he intended. I'm exactly what I appear to be. Nothing more, nothing less. Aisha remained kneeling in the dirt, her expression patient and understanding. Maybe, she said, but I do not think so. That afternoon, Jake tried to reassert control over the situation by suggesting they take a walk together, away from the settlement where they could talk privately. He had planned to use the opportunity to deploy his most sophisticated romantic strategies, but once again, Aisha's response caught him completely off guard. Yes, she said simply. I would like to show you something special. She led him up a winding trail into the foothills of the nearby mountains, moving with surprising grace and endurance despite her fuller figure. Jake, who prided himself on his physical fitness, found himself struggling to keep up with her steady pace in the thin desert air. Where did you learn to climb like this? He asked, breathing hard as they paused at a rocky outcrop. Apache children learn to walk on all kinds of ground, she replied, not even slightly winded. Mountain, desert, river, we must know how to move in our world. When they reached their destination, a hidden canyon with a natural spring and ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock walls, Jake understood why Aisha had brought him there. It was a place of profound beauty and spiritual significance, clearly sacred to her people. My grandmother brought me here when I was small, Aisha said, settling onto a flat rock beside the clear pool. She taught me that some places hold power, hold memory of all people who came before. This place, it remembers many things. As they sat in the peaceful canyon, Jake found himself telling Aisha things he had never shared with anyone, about his childhood in Boston, his parents' death in a factory fire, his years of drifting and gambling and building walls around his heart to protect himself from further loss. You are afraid, Aisha said when he finished, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Afraid that if you let people close, they will hurt you or leave you. So you hurt them first, or you leave first. Always moving, never staying long enough to build something real. Jake stared at the ancient petroglyphs, unable to meet her eyes. Maybe, he whispered. But Jake, Aisha continued, when you always leave, you also always alone. Maybe hurt is price we pay for love, for connection. Maybe loneliness worse than hurt. As they made their way back to the settlement in the gathering darkness, Jake realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. He was no longer thinking about the bet or his strategies for winning it. Instead, he was thinking about the woman beside him, her wisdom, her strength, her ability to see past his carefully constructed facade to the frightened, lonely man beneath. For the first time in years, Jake Sullivan was genuinely interested in someone else's thoughts and feelings, rather than his own needs and desires. The revelation was both terrifying and oddly liberating, like discovering that the walls he had built for protection had also become his prison. On the evening of his 5th day in the settlement, Jake Sullivan found himself facing a crisis that had nothing to do with winning his bet, and everything to do with the growing realization that he was falling in love with Aisha. The woman he had come to deceive and abandon was becoming the most important person in his world, and the knowledge of his original motives filled him with self-loathing. He sat alone by the fire outside the trading post, supposedly planning his next move, but actually wrestling with a conscience he had thought long dead. In 2 days, his week would be up, and Webb would expect him to return to Tucson either married or defeated. But the thought of using Aisha for his bet now made him physically sick. "You look troubled," came Aisha's soft voice from behind him. She approached the fire carrying 2 cups of coffee, her movements as graceful as always despite her size. "May I sit with you?" Jake nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the desert night sounds and watching the stars emerge in the clear Arizona sky. "Aisha," Jake said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I need to tell you something about why I'm really here." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I know why you are here, Jake." The simple statement hit him like a thunderbolt. "You know?" Aisha smiled sadly. "Bill Thompson has friends in Tucson. Word travels fast in territory. We heard about Bet before you arrived." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "Then why did you let me stay? Why have you been so kind to me?" "Because," Aisha said, reaching over to touch his hand, "I wanted to see what kind of man you really are. Not man who makes cruel bets, but man who sits with Apache woman and shares stories of his heart. Not man who tries to trick people, but man who learns to tend garden and asks real questions about life." Jake stared at her in amazement. "You knew it was all a lie, and you still—" "I knew beginning was lie," Aisha corrected gently. "But I think maybe middle and end, they are becoming truth." "Yes." The accuracy of her insight left Jake speechless. Everything had changed since his arrival. The charming manipulator who had ridden into the settlement was being replaced by someone he barely recognized, someone capable of genuine feeling and honest connection. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what I planned to do to you. You deserve so much better than someone like me." Aisha was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the firelight. "Jake," she said finally, "what if I told you that I want to marry you anyway?" Jake's head snapped up in shock. "What? But you know about the bet? You know I came here to deceive you." "Yes," she said calmly. "And now I see a man who is sorry for that. Man who has learned something about himself. Man who maybe is ready to choose different path." Jake felt tears burning his eyes, tears he had not shed since childhood. I don't understand. Why would you want to marry someone who came here to use you?" She smiled then, the radiant expression that had been haunting his dreams since his first day in the settlement. "Because that man, he is gone. The man sitting with me now, he is different. He sees Aisha not as bet to win or woman to fool, but as person worthy of respect and maybe love." The hope in her voice broke something open in Jake's chest. "More than maybe," he said softly. "I love you, Aisha. I love your wisdom, your strength, your kindness. I love the way you see through my pretenses to something better than I thought I could be. But I don't deserve you." "Deserve," Aisha repeated thoughtfully. Interesting word. Does anyone deserve love? Or do we choose to give it freely, as gift? She stood up and moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the sage and sweet grass scent that was uniquely hers. "Jake Sullivan," she said formally. "If you ask me to marry you, really ask not for bet, but for love, I will say yes." Jake rose to his feet, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "Aisha," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you marry me? Not because of any bet or any reason except that I love you more than I thought possible, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of the gift you're offering me." "Yes," she said simply, and then she was in his arms, her soft body pressed against his chest as he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. As they stood together under the vast Arizona sky, Jake realized that he had lost his bet in the most spectacular way possible, and won something infinitely more valuable in return. The money Webb would collect from him was a small price to pay for the discovery that love was not about conquest or manipulation, but about finding someone who could see your true self and choose to love it anyway. Tomorrow they would be married according to Apache custom, with Bill Thompson serving as witness and translator. Jake would return to Tucson afterward, not as a triumphant winner, but as a man transformed by love. He would pay his debt to Webb and the others, then return immediately to begin his new life with Aisha. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Sullivan had found something worth staying for. The Apache wedding ceremony took place at sunset, with the entire settlement gathered in a circle around the sacred fire that Bill Thompson had helped Jake prepare according to traditional customs. Aisha wore a magnificent dress of white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her family line, while Jake had traded his usual gambling attire for simple but respectful clothing that Thompson had helped him acquire. The ceremony itself was both foreign and deeply moving to Jake. There were no familiar Christian words or rituals, but the meaning transcended language barriers. Aisha's uncle, a respected elder named Joseph, spoke in Apache, while Thompson quietly translated the ancient vows that bound two souls together in the sight of the Creator and the community. Do you, Jake Sullivan, take this woman not just as wife, but as partner in all things? Will you honor her wisdom, protect her people as your own, and walk beside her on the path of life until the Great Spirit calls you home? I do, Jake said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Do you, Aisha, daughter of the desert wind, take this man not just as husband, but as the one who will learn your ways and add his strength to yours? Will you guide him on the true path and trust him with the sacred responsibility of your heart? I do, Aisha replied, her dark eyes fixed on Jake's face with absolute certainty. When the ceremonial corn pollen was sprinkled over their joined hands and the blessing songs filled the desert air, Jake felt something shift fundamentally in his soul. This was not the quick, meaningless ceremony he had originally planned to use for his bet. This was a sacred commitment that transformed him at the deepest level. As the celebration continued around them with traditional foods, music, and dancing, Jake found himself marveling at how completely his life had changed in just 1 week. The cynical gambler who had ridden into the settlement no longer existed, replaced by a man who understood for the first time what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. When the evening's festivities finally ended, and the well-wishers had returned to their homes, Jake and Aisha found themselves alone in the small adobe house that the community had prepared for them. Jake had been so focused on the emotional transformation of their relationship that he had given little thought to the physical intimacy that would come with marriage. But now, standing in the doorway of their new home, he felt suddenly nervous. Aisha seemed to sense his uncertainty. She moved about the room, lighting oil lamps and arranging the gifts their wedding guests had brought, her movements calm and purposeful as always. When she turned to face him, her expression was gentle but direct. You are afraid, she observed, not as a criticism, but as a simple statement of fact. Not afraid, Jake said, then reconsidered. Well, maybe a little. This is all so new to me, Aisha. Not just marriage, but feeling this way about someone. Caring more about your happiness than my own. I don't want to disappoint you. Aisha approached him slowly, her bare feet silent on the woven rugs that covered the floor. Jake, she said softly, you think too much about what you should do, what you should feel. Apache way is to trust what comes naturally when two people love each other. She reached up to touch his face, her palm warm against his cheek. I'm not small, delicate woman, like others you have known. Maybe you think this is a problem? Jake caught her hand in his, pressing it more firmly against his face. Aisha, you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Not because of your size, or despite it, but because of who you are. Your strength, your wisdom, your incredible capacity for love, that's what takes my breath away. The wonder that crossed her features told Jake that perhaps no one had ever spoken to her this way before, focusing on her inner qualities rather than making cruel comments about her appearance. The thought that anyone could fail to see her beauty made him angry on her behalf. You really see me this way? She whispered. I see you exactly as you are, Jake replied. And I am amazed that someone like you could love someone like me. What happened next surprised Jake completely. Instead of the shy submission he might have expected from women in his past experience, Aisha took the lead with confident grace. She showed him that love was not about conquest or performance, but about mutual respect, genuine care for each other's pleasure, and the joy of two souls connecting completely. Her touch was both gentle and strong, her kisses both tender and passionate. She loved him with her whole being, holding nothing back. And in doing so, she taught him what it meant to be truly intimate with another person. For the first time in his life, Jake understood that physical love was most powerful when it was an expression of emotional connection rather than mere physical desire. As they lay together afterward, Aisha's head resting on his chest while his fingers traced gentle patterns on her bare shoulder, Jake felt a peace he had never known existed. The frantic energy that had driven him from place to place, conquest to conquest, had been replaced by a deep contentment that came from being exactly where he belonged. Aisha, he said softly, I need to go back to Tucson tomorrow to settle my affairs. But I want you to know that I will come back. This is my home now, here with you. She lifted her head to look at him, her dark eyes serious in the lamplight. I know you will come back, she said simply. You are a different man now, man who keeps promises. As Jake drifted off to sleep with his wife in his arms, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had come to the settlement planning to deceive and abandon her, but instead, she had seen through his masks to the man he could become and loved him into being that person. Tomorrow he would face Webb and the others, admit his failure to use Aisha for their cruel bet, and pay the price for his transformation. But tonight, for the first time in his adult life, Jake Sullivan was exactly where he wanted to be, with the only person who had ever truly understood him. The bet that had seemed like easy money had cost him everything he thought he wanted, and given him everything he never knew he needed. Jake Sullivan rode back into Tucson 3 days later, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and wearing clothes that marked him as a man who had chosen a different path. Gone were the expensive gambler's attire and carefully groomed appearance that had once proclaimed his success in the saloons and gambling halls. In their place were the practical clothing of a man who intended to work with his hands and build something lasting. The Silver Dollar Saloon fell silent when he pushed through the batwing doors, every conversation stopping as the patrons took in his transformed appearance. Marcus Webb and the other men who had made the bet sat at their usual table, money already counted out in expectation of collecting their winnings from Jake's anticipated failure. Well, Webb drawled, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Look what the desert wind blew back in. You're looking a bit rough around the edges, Sullivan. I take it your week with the Apache woman didn't go quite as planned. Jake approached their table steadily, his expression calm but determined. Actually, Webb, it went better than I could have possibly imagined, but not in the way you might expect. Webb's grin widened as he gestured to the money on the table. Don't tell me you actually went through with it? Married that fat squaw for a bet? Hell, Sullivan, I didn't think even you were that heartless. The crude words hit Jake like physical blows, but he kept his expression controlled. Around him, he could feel the attention of every man in the saloon focused on this confrontation that would determine his reputation in Tucson. I did marry her, Jake said quietly, but not for your bet. I married Aisha because she is the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and because she somehow found something in me worth loving despite the foolish reasons that brought me to her. The silence that followed was complete. Webb's confident expression faltered as he tried to process Jake's unexpected response. What are you saying, Sullivan? You trying to tell us you actually fell for some Apache woman? Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, placing it on the table with a solid thunk. I'm saying that your bet cost me the best thing that ever happened to me, and I'm here to pay up and put an end to this sorry business. He opened the pouch and began counting out coins, his entire savings from years of gambling, enough to pay $50 to each man at the table. Here's your money, Webb. $400 as agreed. I lost your bet in the most spectacular way possible. Webb stared at the money, clearly confused by Jake's behavior. Wait just a damn minute. You married her, didn't you? That was the bet. You should be collecting from us. Jake straightened up and looked around the room, addressing not just Webb, but every man present. The bet was that I could charm an Apache woman into marrying me within a week. What actually happened was that she saw through my deception from the first day, knew exactly why I was there, and chose to marry me anyway. Not because of my charm or manipulation, but because she believed I could become a better man than the one who had made such a cruel wager in the first place. The room remained silent as Jake's words sank in. Several men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing themselves in the description of cruelty disguised as humor. So you see, Jake continued, I didn't win your bet at all. Aisha won me. She won my heart, my respect, my commitment to spending the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift she gave me. The Jake Sullivan who made this bet no longer exists. Webb's face had turned red with anger and embarrassment. You gone soft, Sullivan? 1 week with some savage woman and you're talking like a preacher man? What happened to the silver-tongued devil who could charm his way into any woman's bed? Jake smiled then, a genuine expression of contentment that had been absent from his face for years. He found out that there's something infinitely more valuable than conquest or manipulation. He found out what love actually means when it's offered freely by someone who sees all your flaws and chooses to care about your happiness anyway. He picked up his hat from the table and settled it on his head. I'm returning to my wife tomorrow, gentlemen. I have a new life to build, honest work to learn, and a woman to love who deserves far better than the man who first came to her door. The money on that table is my payment for the privilege of learning what kind of person I can be when someone believes in my potential rather than my performance. As Jake turned to leave, one of the younger cowboys at the table called out, Sullivan, what if some of us was to ride up to that settlement? Maybe teach them a lesson about what happens when Indians get above their station. Jake stopped and turned back, his expression deadly serious. Then you would discover that the man who learned to love Aisha also learned to protect what he loves. And you would find that the Apache people have friends you hadn't counted on, including every decent person in this territory who knows the difference between strength and cruelty. He paused, letting his words sink in. But more than that, you would be facing a man who has finally found something worth fighting for. I suggest you reconsider that particular course of action. The threat was delivered quietly, but every man in the room understood that Jake Sullivan had become someone very different from the gambler they had known. This was a man with purpose, with something to protect, and with the kind of quiet confidence that came from being loved completely. Jake left the saloon without another word, knowing he would never set foot in it again. Outside, he breathed the desert air and looked up at the stars that would guide him home to Aisha. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey back to the settlement, back to the woman who had transformed his life by seeing past his worst impulses to the man he could become. The bet had been about conquest and humiliation, but it had led to the greatest victory of Jake's life, the discovery that he was capable of love, commitment, and the kind of happiness that came from building something real with another person. As he prepared to return to his wife and his new life, Jake Sullivan understood that he had found something far more valuable than money or reputation. He had found his true self reflected in the eyes of a woman who had loved him, not for who he pretended to be, but for who he had the courage to become. The desert stretched endlessly before him, but Jake no longer saw it as a barrier to overcome or a challenge to conquer. Instead, it was the path home to the most extraordinary woman he had ever known, a woman whose love had transformed a selfish gambler into a man worthy of the sacred trust she had placed in him. Behind him, the Silver Dollar Saloon buzzed with whispered conversations about Jake Sullivan's dramatic transformation. Some men mocked his choice, calling him weak for abandoning the bachelor life, for marriage to an Apache woman. But others, the ones who had seen the hollow emptiness behind his former charm, recognized that Jake had found something they were still searching for. A reason to be better than he had ever thought. Possible. The stars above seemed brighter as Jake made his final preparations to leave Tucson forever. Tomorrow he would begin the journey back to Asia, back to a life where he was valued not for his silver tongue or his ability to manipulate others, but for his willingness to work hard, love deeply, and honor the sacred promise he had made to the woman who had saved his soul. In the end, the bet that was supposed to prove Jake Sullivan's irresistible charm had instead revealed something far more profound. That true love was not about conquest, but about surrender. Not about what you could take from another person, but about what you were willing to give. And in the gentle strength of an Apache woman who had seen through his masks to the man beneath, Jake had discovered that the greatest victory was not winning a bet, but losing yourself completely to find someone infinitely better than who you used to be.